Evening, everyone. Thank you so much for registering for our California Reparations and Lobbying 101 Informational. This is a virtual workshop, so we are so elated that everyone registered and will take hold of this informative information. But before we get started, I do want to acknowledge our regional director, Shante Fuller, as well as our regional coordinator of the social action team. I am Sonia Jackson, which is the Northern California Social Action Coordinator. Also want to acknowledge Denise Green, which she took the lead on this. She's a representative of Omega Lambda Zeta of Rancho Cordova. So I'm so elated that she took on this project, and it's also hosted by the Northern California Social Action Committee. So with no further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our Madam State Director, Desiree St. Louis, to give us our opening remarks.
Thank you so much. I'd just like to say welcome. My name is Desiree St. Louis. I'm the Northern California State Director. I am so happy to be here to have this time with not only the Northern California Coordinator, our Social Action Coordinator, and the Omega Lambda Zeta chapter, combining, talking about the reparations here in California. We've been talking about it a lot in San Francisco. And so I'm so happy that we're all coming together. So I would like to just welcome everybody. She has already welcomed our regional director, Shante Fuller. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for everybody for being here. Soul Wars, friends, and family. So I'll hand it back over to you.
Okay, well, thank you all for being here again today. It's a pleasure to be able to put this event together. I think this is an important issue that we definitely wanted to touch on. There will be an opportunity for Q&A after each portion. If you can just drop those questions that you might have in the chat, and myself and Sonia will go through those. I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker. Kamila Moore is a repertory justice scholar and an attorney with a specialization in entertainment and intellectual property transactions. As a law student, Moore contributed to human rights reports related to domestic and international human rights issues, including but not limited to racial inequity in Brazil, the human rights to sanitation in Lodoss County, Alabama, USA, and the human rights to remedy in Indigenous Black women affected by racial gender violence in Papua New Guinea. While studying abroad at the University of Amsterdam, Moore wrote a master's thesis exploring the intersections between international law and reparatory justice for transatlantic slave trade, chattel slavery, and their legacies. She earned a Juris Doctorate degree from Columbia Law School in New York City, a Master's of Law degree in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam, and a bachelor's degree from the University of California, Los Angeles. Kamila Moore was appointed to the Reparations Task Force by Speaker then Assembly Anthony Rendon. And I have Ms. Moore to join us here.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I'm so ecstatic to be here with you all for this informational today. My name is Kamila Moore, and I served as the chairperson on the First in the Nation California Reparations Task Force. The task force, we'll get into it in terms of a presentation that I prepared. I understand that we are kind of, we have a limited amount of time. So since the task force has ended, I've given presentations all over on, again, what the task force, worked on, what was our work product, and what's going on now in terms of the legislation that, is currently being debated on the state capitol right now based on the task force's recommendation. So sharing that just to give you a quick overview of what I'll be sharing in the time that I have. Just giving you a brief overview of the task force, what we studied, what proposals we developed, and then again, we'll cap it off with giving you all a comprehensive update on the various different bills that have came out of the task force's work and what stages they are in. So without further ado, if anyone doesn't have any questions before we proceed, I'm happy to share my screen and just go directly into the presentation. Okay, I will share my screen right now. Okay, does everyone see this okay?
Yes.
Thank you so much. So this presentation, it's on a website that I have kept online since the task force has ended. It's called californiareparations.info. This presentation is called On the Badges and Incidents of Slavery. And that title will be more clear as we move forward into this presentation. All right, I'm getting some technical, okay. All right, so first, before we get into the work product of the task force, how did this task force come to be? It came to be via a legislative statute called AB 3121 that was introduced into the state legislature by then California Assembly member Shirley Weber. She's now, as you all know, California's first African-American Secretary of State. But while she was in the state assembly, she introduced this historic bill that created the California Reparations Task.
100%.
I think someone's mic is so okay, so the task force, we held over 16 public meetings over the course of 2 years. And I'll get into more details about what we talked about in the course of 2 years. But for instance, we started from June 2021 to June 2023. And within those 2 years, we heard over 80 hours of testimony from over 150 personal and expert witnesses. We received over 30 hours of public comment, well over 3,000 emails, and well over 300 phone calls. So again, this gives an overview of the timeline, right? AB 3121 was a bill that created the task force, was signed into law by Governor Newsom, September 30th, 2020. The first year I characterized as a study phase where we were, inviting over 100 witnesses to provide personal expert testimony on not only slavery, but what the task force defined as the lingering badges and incidents of slavery, of the 12 major areas that we found a systemic discrimination that still persists in this society, and justifies the need for reparations policy. The second year we characterized as the development stage. So our second and final year, we were essentially coming up with reparations proposals based on everything that we learned and studied together in the first year. And so at the end of our second year, we produced an 1,100-page final report. Most of the contents catalog the different harms and atrocities and describes at length the various different forms of systemic discrimination that we're saying there needs to be reparations for. But the final report also includes over 115 policy recommendations to address the problems that we identified. And that's where the reparations legislation comes in. Those reparations legislation that's in the Capitol right now, they are based on the task force's final recommendations. And quick note, the task force, we were officially a legislative advisory body. So our official role and capacity as an official state commission is to or was to advise the state legislature on the types of reparation proposals that they should turn into law. And a quick aside in terms of what is reparations, right? It's a very politically charged term, right? But the layman's definition of it is simply making amends for offense or harm done. As someone who's come into this reparation space from an international law or human rights law lens, right? I studied human rights law in law school, right? There's a international legal definition for reparations. Most Americans, when they think about reparations, they do think just mainly about cash or compensation. That is one necessary, crucial element when we talk about reparations. There's also 4 other forms of reparations under international law as well, like rehabilitation, right? How do you rehabilitate the minds, right? The souls, right, of a particular group of people who have been victimized over centuries, right? Satisfaction, that's more symbolic. So that could look like a formal apology from the state of California on its role in not only perpetuating enslavement, but in perpetuating these lingering badges and incidents of slavery. Restitution, that could look like taking account for stolen land, right? Unjust property takings, things like that. It could look like free education, right? Taking into account the deprivations that African Americans have, endured in terms of, access to education in this country, even starting from slavery when we weren't allowed to read and write, right? And then the fifth form of reparations under international law is guarantees of non-repetition. And that gets at more structural and institutional policy change. How do you get the state to guarantee to stop harming, right, the aggrieved group, right? Easier said than done. In terms of domestic examples of reparations, there has been reparations given out to other folks in America before, right? Japanese American internment camp survivors received reparations in the late 1980s. Also, African Americans who are descendants of folks who were murdered, Black folks who were murdered during the Rosewood Race Massacre in Florida, they actually still to this day, via the Florida State Legislature, receive free college tuition to state colleges and universities if they can show genealogical connection to a person who was enslaved, a person who was massacred in that massacre. And then international examples, I think the best example is, the denazification of, Germany after World War II and the commitments Germany has made to Holocaust survivors and their heirs. So this just gives a quick sample. This is just a sample of the official public hearings that the task force did over the course of 2 years. Again, each of our hearings were around studying the major areas of systemic discrimination that still exists today. And then they were around developing reparation proposals to eradicate those major areas of systemic discrimination. So our first hearing, of course, we talked about the slave trade, the institution of slavery, California's role in that, right? We also talked about, after that history, more contemporary forms of discrimination, like discrimination in housing, banking, tax, and labor, gentrification, infrastructure, and homelessness. Because we're in a state that is, we talked about entertainment, sports, arts, and culture. We talked about technology, thinking about the industries that are in this particular state. We talked about unequal and separate education. We also talked about, of course, international law as well. And then, again, like I said, the remainder of our time we spent developing proposals based on everything that we studied. So the picture to the left is a picture of when the statute that created the task force was signed, right? You see elected officials like Shirley Weber. You had Maxine Waters was on this call as well. You had Board of Supervisors Holly Mitchell, Attorney General Rob Bonta, of course, Governor Newsom. And then to the right is a picture of the 9 members on the task force, which included myself and academics like Jovan Scott Lewis out of UC Berkeley, elected officials Stephen Bradford, Monica Montgomery Stepp, Assembly Member Joan Sawyer, of course, Dr. Amos Brown, who was the vice chair of the task force, and he was actually one of 16 students taught by the late Martin Luther King Jr. I am in interest of time, I'm trying to kind of speed through, but also be comprehensive as I can. In terms of the thesis of the final report, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we found, right, that actually on the federal level, Congress actually still to this day, currently through Section 2 of the 13th Amendment, has the authority and the power and the duty, I should say, rather, the duty to eradicate any lingering badges and incidents of slavery. However, we found, right, in terms of the thesis of our final report, throughout the rest of American history, instead of abolishing the badges and incidents of slavery, the United States federal, state, and local governments, including California, have perpetuated and created new iterations of these badges and incidents. The resulting harms have been innumerable and have snowballed over generations. And so this final report, we focused on, these harms, these 12 major areas of systemic discrimination. And we go on to say, so thoroughly have the effects of slavery infected every aspect of American society over the last 400 years, it's nearly impossible to identify every badge and incident of slavery, to include every piece of evidence or describe every harm done to African Americans. So in order to address this reality, this practical reality, we again just focus on the 12 major areas of systemic discrimination. But trust me, we could have been very much more exhaustive in terms of what we study. But to address the practical reality of things, we just focus on 12 major areas of systemic discrimination. So I mentioned this in terms of the structure of the report. Our first chapter is obviously on enslavement. Each chapter, there's a California section and a federal section, because we understood our role, right? We're the first state in the nation to do this type of work, to actually study and develop reparations proposals for this particular group of people. We've beaten the federal government in its own duty and responsibility in doing this work, because I just mentioned, right? They actually have the duty to do this type of work via Section 2 of the 13th Amendment, but they have abdicated their duty. They have abdicated their responsibility. And so in light of that, that's why the task force, we don't only focus on California's history when it comes to perpetuating these major areas of systemic discrimination. We have a California section that describes clearly California's role in it, but we also have a federal section that describes very clearly the federal government's role, and in some instances, other states' roles in perpetuating these various different forms of systemic discrimination. Just wanted to bring that up. So, after enslavement, right, the 12 major areas of systemic discrimination or badges of incidents of slavery that flow out of this poisonous tree, this institution of slavery, are racial terror, political disenfranchisement, housing segregation, separate and unequal education, racism in the environment and infrastructure, pathologizing of the Black family, control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life, stolen labor and hindered opportunity, the unjust legal system, mental and physical harm and neglect, and the wealth gap. So, think about the institution of slavery, right, being a poisonous tree, and these badges and incidents of slavery being the fruit, right, of this poisonous tree. And so for the remainder of the presentation, and also I understand in the interest of time, I'm going to briefly touch on each of these areas that's in our report, but I do want to reserve most of the time for questions and for us to talk about that legislation that's actually pending right now. So if anyone wants to intervene to time check me, please let me know. Okay, so we talk about California's role in enslavement. Part of the role of the task force was to demystify, to disrupt these myths and narratives that get in the way of us securing liberation and true justice. One of the myths that we had to contend with was that California was a free state. And we learned through, again, expert witness testimony, right, from academics who've dedicated their entire careers to studying this, like Professor Stacy Smith from Oregon State University, who shared with us, right, through her work, that there actually was slavery in this state. There wasn't as many slaves as there were in the South, but right, one is too many, and there were actually slaves in this state, at least 1,500 slaves in this state, brought mainly by enslavers from the South to California to mine for gold, for instance, during the gold rush period. But not only that, California also enacted a fugitive slave law, right? We learned together in 1852, 2 years after it was admitted into the Union. And that was very rare for free states at the time, which meant essentially California was not a sanctuary state for runaway slaves, right? Through that law, if you ran away to California for refuge, you could be deported back to the South to be re-enslaved, or wherever else in the United States to be re-enslaved, even on California soil. So now we talked about enslavement, and then we also have to understand federally, we know this, right? We found that, America's wealth was built on trafficked African peoples and their descendants. When we talk about, again, to the badges and incidents of slavery, we take a more historical lens, but we also include data, present day data as well. So I guess you could say this is from a more historical lens in terms of racial terror. We found that the Ku Klux Klan established local chapters all over the state in the 1920s in California. During that time, California sometimes even held more KKK events than Mississippi or Louisiana. And many of California's KKK members were prominent individuals who held positions in civil leadership and police departments. We talk about political disenfranchisement. And we talk about, for instance, how this is the picture, I'm going to go back to it, is Rayfield Lundy, who is the African-American assembly member in 1952, who actually inspecting a cross that's burned in his house in Los Angeles, right, as an act of political intimidation, right? A lot of the acts of political intimidation and disenfranchisement that people think was really just reserved for the South actually occurred in California as well. For instance, California had enacted a poll tax at a certain point in time and literacy tests as well. And in fact, California did not ratify the 14th and the 15th Amendments, right? The amendments that gave Black Americans full citizenship rights and the amendments that gave Black Americans the right to vote. California did not ratify those amendments until the late 1950s. We also talk about housing segregation as a badge and incident of slavery. All of this data, these anecdotes, these pictures are from our final report. In LA, it's a picture of two African-American men, William Bailey and Roger Duncan, in 1952. Both of their houses were firebombed, and notes were left at their homes threatening all the Black families on the street if they didn't move out. And those types of violent incidents actually rose in California in the 1950s and 1960s after the courts finally declared racially restrictive covenants unenforceable. But in this section, we talk about California's clear role in perpetuating housing segregation, from redlining to racially restrictive covenants to under enforcing or under prosecuting these violent incidents that left people like William Bailey and Roger Duncan without homes. So the next Badger incident of slavery we talk about is separate and unequal education. And we found that California remains the sixth most segregated state in the country for Black students. Actually, we also learned from expert witness testimony from Black American education scholars and policy workers that California has become a don't say Black state, where it's been, because of Proposition 209 banning racial considerations in areas of education, contracting, and employment, it's been increasingly difficult to enact policy, particularly for Black students, which makes these issues much worse when we're talking about the lack of funding and the high segregation of these schools. The next Badger incident of slavery we talk about is racism in the environment and infrastructure. And like nationally, we found that Black Californians are more likely than white Californians to live in overcrowded housing and near hazardous waste. The next Badger incident of slavery we talk about is the pathologizing of the Black family. That's where we talk about, the stereotypes that the Black family has endured, the stereotypes that Black women in particular have endured in this country, like the myth of the welfare queen, for instance, we found through data, right? We talk about welfare policies. Actually, white women have been the #1 beneficiaries of welfare policy in this country, like the Mother's Pension Act in the early 1920s, right? Single white women were the main beneficiaries of that policy by over 90%, right? African-American single mothers were excluded from that policy. And that, for instance, just shows, for instance, we've been kind of relegated with this stereotype of the welfare queen, when it doesn't match up with the data historically when it comes to, we know historically how the social safety net in this country, we've been excluded from gaining the benefits of the social safety net, from welfare to the GI Bill to, the Homestead Act. We can keep going. We also talk about, Black children being overrepresented in foster care as well in the state of California and in the United States. The next badger incident of slavery, there's just a few more that we talk about and create policy around, is control over creative, cultural, and intellectual life. And in this chapter, we talk about how there was once thriving African-American communities across the state of California, like the Fillmore in San Francisco, or this Jazz District in Central Ave in South Central LA. All of these communities have essentially been decimated, either through urban renewal, where highways, freeways were intentionally carved within these communities, through other forms of racially motivated eminent domain, through redlining and other forms of disinvestment, right? These communities no longer exist. So we talk about that in this report. And we talk about the contributions that Black artists from in terms of arts and sciences have contributed to this country, and the intellectual property deprivations that they've endured as well. This is a picture from our report, Little Richard, who's, obviously famous for one of his songs, Tutti Frutti. He was actually protesting, a record company back in the 1980s, feeling like he was taken advantage of, essentially selling, that monumental record for pennies on the dollar. The next badger incident of slavery is stolen labor and hindered opportunity. We talk about, for instance, in California cities, they didn't hire Black workers for certain public sectors until the late 1970s, right? In 1970, when Black residents made up 14% of San Francisco's population, only 4 of the department's 1,800 uniformed firefighters were Black. We talk about the unjust legal system, right? Like the rest of the country, California stops, shoots, and kills and imprisons more African Americans than their share of the Black population. We also learned through expert witness testimony, Black Americans have been the #1 victims of hate crimes in this country since this nation's inception. In terms of the state of California, we've been the #1 victims of hate crimes as well. And where I reside in the state of LA, the city of LA rather, we're also the #1 victims of hate crimes here, which you wouldn't think due to common media portrayals, but we are the #1 victims of hate crimes, and there's evidence to show that anti-Black hate crimes are actually on the rise. Trigger warning. This is one of the chapters is on mental and physical harm and neglect. And we found that, for instance, there's a 7-year life expectancy gap between white Californians and Black Californians. And that picture was from our report on a national level, speaking how, the medical system was built on racism. That picture was a picture from 1898 of medical students at the University of Maryland, right, dissecting a Black woman's body. And what was etched on the side of the table was a saying that said, "Her loss is our gain," which I think is really indicative of, the African-American experience in this country and how we've been treated. And from the lens of white supremacy, right? Our collective loss is the gain of, collective white supremacy. So the last badger incident of slavery we talk about is the wealth gap. And the late Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned, the wealth gap in some of in his latest years, right? In one of his speeches, he talked about the Homestead Act in particular. And he said, while America refused to give the Negro any land, at the same time was giving away millions and millions of acres of land nearly for free to its newly arriving peasant class from Europe, which meant, he went on to say, that the United States was willing to undergird, these newly arriving peasants from Europe with an economic floor while denying that same right and opportunity to African Americans. So he was talking about particularly the federal and California Homestead Acts that, like he said, gave away hundreds of millions of acres of land, almost for free, mostly to white families. Black Americans were by and large excluded from that policy. Some did benefit, but by and large, we were excluded from that policy. So what are the present day implications of just that one example of exclusionary public policy, right? Because there are various different forms of exclusionary public policy that we weren't able to benefit from that has present day implications today. So, for instance, for the California Federal Homestead Act, today, as many as 46 million white folks living today, are descendants of that exclusionary land transfer, and still to this day reap the wealth benefits. That's nearly a quarter, 25% of the adult population of the United States still benefits from the Homestead Act. Again, something that African Americans were not able to benefit from collectively. When we talk about there is no wealth gap. Also, I will say it's going to take 228 years to close the racial wealth gap between white Americans and Black Americans. We noted through our work that there is no racial wealth gap study for the state of California. So we actually recommended, we didn't have time to do that ourselves. So our recommendation was for the legislature to do that work, the racial wealth gap study for this particular state. But there are some institutions like the UCLA Labor Department that has done this work for various different cities, figuring out the racial wealth gap for various different cities like Boston, Miami, and Los Angeles. And for instance, they found that African Americans have an average of $200 of liquid assets compared to $110,000 for white households, and $72,000 for African Black households of mainly immigrant origin. And in 2019, white households owned 9 times more assets than Black households. And, it's important to say, well, $200, that's what could we be doing better? It's important not to internalize. Yes, we need to have conversations amongst our community about how we can uplift each other. Of course, that's a given. But it's important not to internalize our wealth position, right? What I feel like the value of me being on this task force is that I learned myself, even as chair, I learned so much. And, I learned that it's not healthy to internalize our position collectively as African Americans. There's actual policy, right, that we can actually study to show and demonstrate why we're in the position that we're in. And it's of no fault of our own, right? It's the fault of the state, of the country. And that's what reparations is essentially about. It's ensuring that the state, right, then the United States, and that includes the United States, takes accountability for its own actions, and in some cases its own omissions in terms of perpetuating this exclusionary public policy. And so, just to conclude, we talk, the task force also, I said, after all of that 1,100 pages, there's also a section where we talk about, well, what are the recommendations? What do we recommend to solve all of these problems? And so, one of those recommendations, we recommended a new state agency. We recommended, in terms of to rectify, mental and physical harm and neglect, establishing and funding a community wellness center in Black communities. And funding research to study the mental health issues within California's Black youth population to address the rising suicide rates among Black youth. We, recommended increasing funding to schools through the local control funding formula. We recommended providing property tax relief to descendants living in formerly redlined neighborhoods, or to provide a program to, give folks, descendants of slaves, an opportunity to purchase homes or to pay down their mortgage if they already have a home, and things like that. And so now I want to stop here because I want to see if anyone has any questions. Then I'm going to change over to my screen so that we can talk about the pending reparations legislation on another website. So does anyone have any questions for now before I get into the legislation aspect of the work? So that presentation, I just gave you a comprehensive overview of what the task force did over the course of 2 years. And now this next part of the presentation, I'll share with you what legislation has been introduced based on the task force's recommendations and where we are now with that legislation.
I have a question.
Yes.
I want to know, who is the target audience? Is it just folks who are descendants, or if you have any mixed race where there's a small percentage of African descendant? How do you know who the target audience will be, because folks are kind of mixed race, and how far down the lineage do you go?
Right. So in terms of we had over 115 policy recommendations. Some of the policy recommendations are universal. So they're going to directly and indirectly benefit everyone. And that'll be more clear when I talk about the different legislation. Some of the policy recommendations are, in a sense, race-based. So, for Black people, to the extent that we can in the state, because I just said, race-based affirmative action is illegal in 3 areas in this state, particularly education, contracting, and employment. So outside of those 3 areas, we do have some policies that are race-based. But then there are some policies, and mainly those policies are for more direct benefits that actually are missing in this current package, in this current legislative package, but that's a whole other conversation. But, some of our policies are lineage based. So the criteria is, for cash payments, for instance, direct cash payments, which, for instance, is not a bill that has been introduced by any legislator in this legislative session. No legislator introduced a bill providing for direct cash payments for descendants of slaves. But if they did, the criteria that the task force came up with, is you are eligible for not only cash payments, but more other substantive and direct reparations benefits if you are a descendant of a free or an enslaved Black person living in the United States prior to 1900. So it actually, in terms of the criteria, it's race neutral on its face. So you can actually presently identify as multiracial, right? You could be Black and white, Black American and white, or Black American Asian, or Black American and Mexican, right? But because you fit within that criteria, if you can find that you're a descendant of a free and enslaved Black person living in the United States prior to 1900, then you meet that criteria, then you're eligible, even though you're not full Black, you're mixed race. That makes sense. So it's about the criteria of being a lineal descendant to someone who is essentially enslaved in this country. Now, how do you get, I understand there's challenges to that. We talked about that at length during the task force, and we actually invited 6 genealogists to help us as expert witnesses to help us through this question of, if we go with the lineage option, how is that going to be practical or functional? And they gave us some really great advice. But I will say, in one of the bills that has been introduced since the task force ended by State Senator Stephen Bradford is SB 1403. It would create a new state agency to administer any future reparations policies and programs that are passed by the legislature. And that bill, in that office, rather, there would be a genealogy office. There would be a secretary of the agency, a legal counsel of the agency, and then a genealogy office. And there might be future offices now, but currently how the bill is written now, it would be those 3 offices. In the genealogy office, there would be expert genealogists hired to work in that office to essentially help people trace their lineage to become eligible for any future programs. And I'll just conclude by saying, that's a relatively normal process when we study reparations models for other communities, right? The Japanese American internment camp survivors, they had the Office of Redress Administration, where they had similar function, where you had to prove that you were interned, or that you were an heir of someone who was interned. Or, Jewish Holocaust survivors kind of had a similar process. It would be a similar process for us, but understanding there are going to be some challenges because, due to slavery, we weren't counted as human beings on the census until after slavery was abolished, obviously, in 1870. We weren't counted as human beings until the 1870 census. And so in genealogy, there's something called the 1870 brick wall, where it's sometimes hard for African Americans to find their enslaved ancestor prior to 1870, because we weren't, listed as human beings with our full names prior to. But there are ways around it, and there's certain rebuttable presumptions. I'll just share one last thing. One of the expert genealogists who actually now works for Ancestry, she said, if for people who can't find an enslaved ancestor, it could be, you can use a rebuttable presumption, like, were your grandparents in the South in the 1930s and were their sharecroppers, right? If your grandparents were in, sharecroppers in the South, for instance, it's a rebuttable presumption that that they themselves are descendants of enslaved people, right? Because that's what sharecroppers were. My family, they were sharecroppers in Mississippi. A lot of them were sharecroppers on the same land that their families were enslaved on. So, the genealogists, they came up with various different creative tests and ways in which people can meet that criteria.
And then we have a question from Ms. Joy Lewis.
Yes, thank you so much. This was a great historical overview of, national and California trends. My question was in terms of enslavement, racial terror, and in terms of other things. And the mentioning of, way back when, pro-slavery whites supported, the enslavement of Blacks. In terms of racial terror, there were, KKK chapters established in California. Were there any regional differences that came up in your findings? And do any remnants of those differences and trends in terms of location, do they still exist today? I am curious to know, I want to know kind of like the regional differences in California. And did you identify any of those trends today?
Wow, that's a really good question. And actually it's something I haven't really thought deeply on before you asked it, in terms of, regional differences. For instance, Northern California versus, Central California versus Southern California, in terms of the history of discrimination in the state and present day implications. Something that's coming to my mind right now, for instance, we learned San Bernardino was a slave colony. So there was slavery all throughout this state. We learned there were slaves in LA, there were slaves in the Bay Area, but in particular, San Bernardino, in Southern California, was a slave colony. And so I guess present day implications of that, there's a lot of racism, particularly in law enforcement throughout the state, but also in San Bernardino. But what I found interesting, there was a poll that came out after the task force was ended, by the Berkeley Intergovernmental Studies, and they polled 6,000 voters across the state of California, and they asked them a series of questions about the task force. But one general question they asked was, do you think the state is doing too little, too much, or just enough for Black people? And it was San Bernardino County, San Bernardino, but Riverside County, or a county that is within, that San Bernardino is within, was the only county throughout the state of California who said the state was doing too much for Black people. All the other counties said the state was doing enough, or maybe a few more liberal counties said the state is doing too little. But it was that county that San Bernardino resides in that was saying the state is doing too much for Black people. So I was like, oh, okay, that tracks. The county that, was once a slave colony in this state. Yeah. And then you talk to people who live in San Bernardino, a lot of people don't even know that history. It's suppressed. I'm trying to think of, again, that's a really great question. And I feel like I can think about it a little bit more to generate a more comprehensive answer, but that's just something that popped up for now. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Looks like we have another question in the chat. Out of curiosity, if California decides not to give reparations, then can the state be sued for allowing these terrible acts against Blacks to continue and for previous injustice?
That's a great question as well. And, I'm just going to put into the chat the recent news that in next year's budget, the state legislature and the governor, they came to an agreement on what the 2024-2025 state budget will look like. And the budget it's $300 billion budget. But within that budget, the state allocated $12 million on reparations implementation funding. So essentially that $12 million for next year's budget will go towards implementing whatever reparations legislation is passed into law. And so, a lot of people are saying that's not nearly enough, and I agree, it's really not enough. But at the same time, you know, the fact that a state is allocating, you know, money in the millions, right, for reparations for this particular group of people, I think is a huge step that shouldn't be overlooked, because essentially, getting to the crux of your question, it's them essentially acknowledging the harm, right? Acknowledging their role in perpetuating these major areas of systemic discrimination that I mentioned. If, you know, if they didn't acknowledge it, they wouldn't have put money behind it. So I see it as a, you know, a good faith effort, a good step in the right direction in terms of culpability, right? It's a clear stamp to me that they're owning up to um you know, taking responsibility. And it's up to us, you know, as citizens and as residents of the state, to keep pushing um and holding them accountable to that. So I mean, in terms of the question of um can we sue, sorry, I lost question. Then can the state be sued for allowing these terrible acts? I mean, potentially, but it's a bit complex. But you know, the legislative route is the route that we're taking for now, and it's working out. You know, because like I said, you have the state legislature and the governor committing at least some funding to this issue.
I think we have time for just one more question. I see Karen's hand raised. You can unmute yourself.
There's also 2 more questions in the chat. We can save those for afterward.
Okay. I have a 2-part question regarding $12 million that's been allocated for the 24-25 fiscal year. Is that in perpetuity? And then who or what determines how those funds are being allocated for each year regarding the badges and incidents that are being addressed at a particular time?
No, that's a good question. The first part of the question, you know, there's a lot of unanswered, you know, questions essentially. But the reparations legislation funding, that $12 million, it says verbatim, the budget provides $12 million for 2024 to 2025 to begin to implement reparations legislation that may be enacted into law. Based on future enacted legislation, so on the question of whether this funding is in perpetuity, it says based on future enacted legislation, the director of finance may augment, right, or increase one or more departmental items in the budget with such funding. So essentially, I read that as this funding is this of $12 million for this upcoming fiscal year is a floor, and based on any future reparations legislation that is enacted, the director of finance of the state can increase, you know, the funding essentially. And so again, that is really great that we're having this conversation, because we're going to need to hold the state accountable for these commitments. I just put you know, the tweet where I talk about the funding, and I also linked the state budget trailer bill. And so in terms of like who's going to be responsible, I'm having the same questions, like who's going to be responsible for, you know, the allocation of this 12 million. I'm here with you in terms of, I'm not sure. But I know that 12 million, again, in terms of how it's allocated, is based on the reparations legislation that passes out of the state legislature and then is signed by the governor. So in terms of legislative deadlines, the state legislature has until August 30th to pass reparations bills this year. August 30th is their deadline. So that's a deadline we're looking for this reparations legislation to pass. And then Governor Newsom has until September 30th to sign any of those bills that pass the legislature into law. So we won't really know, maybe until September 30th, the deadline for Governor Newsom to sign these laws, which reparations bills have officially signed, and then seeing from those bills that have been officially passed and signed into law, which that 12 million will go to. I'm hoping, for instance, that SB 1403, which create that new state agency that provides that infrastructure, that will be the house, the agency to administer any future reparations programs and policies for descendants of slaves. Then I'm also hoping that Senate Bill 1331, which will create a new account in the state treasury. And currently how that bill is written, there is no funding mechanism. So in that bill, it just would create an account in the treasury, but there would be no money in it. Let's say SB 1403 and SB 1331 pass the state legislature and are signed by Governor Newsom, right? That $12 million can go towards, setting up the infrastructure for that agency, putting some money into that fund, and then for other legislation as well. So that's just, but there's, still lots of moving parts. So I guess for now I can get to us talking about the legislation. And for folks, we can follow along together. A really good resource is an article from KQED that actually tracks the progress in real time, of, the CLBCs, the California Legislative Black Caucus reparations priority package. They introduced 14 reparations bills based on the task force's recommendations in January of this year, and they all are in their each different stages. So for now, we're going to go through this article together to get some real-time updates on these bills. So the first bill is ACA 7. And that is a bill that actually would amend Proposition 209, the bill that I said, bans race-based classifications in areas of contracting, employment, and education. Assemblymember Corey Jackson from Riverside introduced a bill as part of the CLBC's reparations package to amend Proposition 209 to allow the state to fund programs designed to improve the health, education, or economic well-being of specific groups based on race, color, ethnicity, national origin, or marginalized genders or sexual orientations. However, the latest news is that Corey Jackson actually recently pulled this bill from consideration for the November ballot. Quick note, when you see something called a constitutional amendment, that means that it has to go through both houses, the state assembly and the state senate, to pass. But then once it passes through the state legislature, since it's a constitutional amendment, it has to go to the voters to decide. So Corey Jackson pulled that bill for consideration for the November ballot. But he still intends to move the bill through the legislature this year. It's currently awaiting hearing dates in the Senate Judiciary and Elections Committee. I'm not sure why, but probably he didn't see it as politically viable this year. ACA 8, another constitutional amendment. It would remove language from the state's constitution, allowing involuntary servitude as a punishment to a crime. Really great news about ACA 8. It passed the assembly on a bipartisan vote in September. The bill is now pending in the state senate, but it passed the state legislature and it will appear on the ballot in November. So that's the great news here. I think this needs to be this sentence needs to be revised. But yes, the latest news is that it passed the state legislature and voters will be able to decide in November whether they want to amend the California Constitution to remove language that allows for slavery in prisons as punishment to a crime. And that proposition, I believe, is Proposition 6. It's already gotten a number. Proposition 6. The next is Assembly Concurrent Resolution 135. So this is just simply a resolution bill. It would essentially allow for the state legislature to acknowledge the actions of government officials in California who advanced chattel slavery and subsequent discriminatory policies against Black Californians. Why is this reparations? I talked about the 5 forms of reparations under international law, one of them being satisfaction. We talked about formal apologies from the state. formal acknowledgement from the state, right? So this bill fits within the various forms of reparations under international law, particularly satisfaction, right? Getting the state to take accountability for its role in slavery and discrimination. So ACR 135 passed the state assembly on February 26th on a 59-0 vote, which is amazing. And now it's awaiting the Senate Judiciary Committee, right? It has to pass both houses by August 30th. And then it has to be signed into law essentially by Governor Newsom by September 30th. The next bill is Assembly Bill 280. It would limit the use of solitary confinement in state prisons, and it's currently pending in the state assembly, and it hasn't even reached the Senate yet. So we'll see how that goes in terms of timing. Assembly Bill 1815 would prohibit discrimination based on hair texture or hairstyles like braids, locks, and twists. That was one of our recommendations in the task force report. And it's awaiting a third reading in the Senate Appropriations Committee. The next bill is AB 1929. And I'll just say, the CLBC's 14 bills in terms of their priority reparations package, they took a more structural policy approach. So most of these bills do not, unfortunately, provide a direct benefit to, descendants of slaves. However, I think it's a good first step because it's providing, it's creating policy that gets at, eradicating structural racism and discrimination, which is very, very important as well, alongside, of course, more direct benefits. So AB 1929 would require data about recipients of state technical education grants to be disaggregated by race, but not only race lineage as well. If you read the bill, it's more detailed than that. And, it's essentially a bill that, data disaggregation bill to see more clearly, the disparities that Black Americans face in achieving high quality career technical education programs. And so AB 1929 passed the Assembly on a 65-0 vote on April 9th. And it was also approved by the Senate. So now it heads back to the Assembly to approve the amendments made by the Senate committees. The next bill is Assembly Bill 1975. It would require Medi-Cal, the state's public insurance plan, to cover culturally relevant and medically supportive foods or nutrition interventions when deemed necessary by a healthcare provider. So basically, it would provide a state-subsidized nutritionist if you receive Medi-Cal. And the bill was passed by the Senate Appropriations Committee on June 24th, and it's now pending in the Appropriations Suspense File. And that's a special committee where bills go where there's a particular amount of money attached to implementing it. Bills with a certain cost attached to it go to this process called the suspense file. And then if, they judge whether it's feasible fiscally, and if it's not, the bills die until the next year unless they're introduced again. Or, they're passed through this suspense file and then they continue on to the process. So Assembly Bill 1986 is the next bill, and it would require the list of books banned inside California prisons to be publicly displayed and task the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation's Office of the Inspector General to remove book bans if they don't further the interest of managing the prisons. AB 1986 passed the Senate Public Safety Committee on May 28th. It was amended slightly in the Senate Appropriations Committee on June 4th, where it now awaits a third reading. AB 2064 would take money saved from closing state prisons and redirect it to community-based violence prevention programs via a state grant program. When introduced, the bill initially set out to create a grant program to decrease violence in Black communities, but now it got more specific. So AB 2064 passed out of the Assembly on a 55-7 vote on May 21st, and it passed the Senate Committee on Health with minor amendments on June 19th, and the bill now awaits a hearing date in Senate's Public Safety Committee. The next bill is Assembly Bill 2862. It would require licensing boards, which oversee state workforces, such as barbers and real estate agents, to prioritize African-American applicants, especially those who are descendants of slaves. In April, the bill was amended to sunset after 4 years. This bill has already started to get some attention from conservative legal groups who are saying that this bill violates Proposition 209. However, the latest is that AB 2862 was shelved by Gibson before a hearing in the Senate Business Professions and Economic Development Committee. So I guess the bill will no longer be moving forward. This must have been just now recently updated, partly probably because of this challenge from these conservative groups, because you look at what it provides. It requires licensing boards to give preference to Black American applicants, even though it says descendants. I guess because African American applicants, on its face, it looks like it's race-based. And so then it would violate Proposition 209, where I said they ban racial considerations in those 3 particular areas, right? This fits within the area of an employment. So it was already starting to get some pushback. So I mean, you see how so there's that, I guess. So the next bill is it's an apology bill, AB 3089. And it would issue a formal apology for state officials and institutions who promoted, facilitated, and enforced and permitted the institution of slavery. The Assembly passed AB 3089 unanimously, actually, the formal apology bill that builds on the resolution bill that I mentioned earlier. They passed it unanimously on May 16th, marking a key milestone in the first in the nation effort to provide state-level reparations. It now heads to the state Senate. We're getting towards the end in terms of the CLBC's reparations package. The next bill is AB 3131. It would give schools that qualify for the State Board of Education's local control funding formula, equity multiplier, positive consideration for state grants supporting career technical education. When introduced, this bill gave programs based in historically redlined communities first priority for career education grants. So yes, so the latest is that this bill was passed the Assembly with a 72-0 vote on May 23rd, and it passed through the Senate Education Committee and is now set for, I think it got postponed. It says the hearing was set for July 1, but it has not happened yet in the Senate Appropriations Committee. So last but not least, the last bill in the CLBC's 14-bill priority package is Senate Bill 1050. And that was introduced by Senator Stephen Bradford. And it would it would allow for the state to review and investigate and make certain determinations on applications from California residents who claim their land was taken through racially motivated use of eminent domain without being provided fair compensation. So think about, for instance, in Southern California, but this happened all over the state. The Bruces in Manhattan Beach, Black couple in 1920s who owned a beach resort. LA County, owned the land where that resort once stayed, and they partnered with a law firm who helped to find the descendants of the Bruce couple, right, through genealogical research, through genetic testing, to find the direct descendants of the Bruces who were actually living in Florida at the time. And LA County conveyed that land back to them. But because that land had certain zoning restrictions, they couldn't use it, they couldn't make it productive. So even though county conveyed the land back to them, they couldn't use it. And so essentially the LA County bought the land back from them. The land was purchased by LA County to the family, the direct descendants, for upwards to, over $15 million. So essentially this bill would, allow for families similarly situated as the Bruces to, get restitution for that unjust property taking. Either you get the land back if you can, or, the state would provide you that compensation for it. And so, interestingly enough, SB 1050 is dependent on two bills that I mentioned earlier that are also introduced by State Senator Stephen Bradford, right? He actually has introduced the more substantive, more direct benefit bills. It's been State Senator Stephen Bradford in particular. I just want to give him credit for that. This bill would be dependent on his two other bills that I talked about, right? The SB 1403 bill that would create the new state agency, and SB 1331 that would create that new account in the state treasury. So the bill to allow for land restitution is dependent on those two bills passing. The bills would create, again, a new government agency to manage reparations programs for eligible Black Californians, and a state reparations fund to support its work. SB 1050 would instruct the new state agency's Office of Legal Affairs to review claims, make payments to eligible families, and provide public education about the unjust use of eminent domain throughout the state. And so SB 1050 passed the state Senate on May 21st with a 32-4 vote. Only the Republicans voted against it. It passed the Assembly Judiciary Committee on June 11th, and it now is up for a hearing it already had the Senate Appropriations Committee, so that needs to be updated. So it passed through the Senate Appropriations Committee, and now it's going to the Appropriations suspense file, right? That process where bills that have a certain cost attached to it. So the next suspense file hearing is August 15th. So I was in a follow-up email to the organizers of the event, because I think that suspense file hearing August 15th is going to be really important for people to show up to, because that's going to be the process where these legislators are going to have the opportunity to get rid of these bills. And we don't want them to do that. In fact, they actually, just to conclude, there were two additional bills that State Senator Stephen Bradford introduced independently from the CLBC, right? So SB 1050, the land restitution bill, is the only bill that the CLBC included in terms of Bradford's bills as part of their official reparations package. But Bradford, as a longtime legislator, and as a person who was on the task force, he took it upon himself to introduce even more legislation based on the task force's recommendations outside of the CLBC's reparations package, because at the time, they didn't want to adopt all of Bradford's bills. So Bradford introduced SB 1403, which is outside of the CLBC's priority package, that would create the new state agency. He introduced 1331, that would create the new state fund. Both of those bills, as I mentioned, have already passed the state Senate completely. So they just have to go through the state assembly before it goes to Governor Newsom's desk. But Senator Bradford also introduced two more bills that were actually killed a couple of months ago in June through the appropriations suspense file hearing. Those two bills are SB 1013 and SB 1007. Those bills would have allowed for descendants of slaves to get property tax relief if they were still living in formerly redline communities. And then the other bill would have given descendants of slaves opportunity for a grant program to help purchase their first home, or to pay down their mortgage insurance and homeowners insurance, right? Because those are based on the recommendation from the task force that I mentioned earlier in our presentation. So Bradford actually created legislation on those two issues, right? That would allow for just that. However, they were killed during the appropriation suspense file hearing that they had a couple of months ago. So we don't want that to happen again for his other bills, particularly SB 1050 and the bill that would create the new state agency and the new state fund, right? So it's really important for folks to show up or to at least contact their legislators before August 15th to say that they're in support of this legislation. So actually, this is the last bill as part of the CLBC's priority package. It's Senate Bill 1089. It would require companies to provide advance notice to employees, and county officials if a grocery store or pharmacy is closing, and obligate counties to track the closures. And it's reparations because, in part, predominantly white neighborhoods have 4 times as many grocery stores as predominantly Black neighborhoods. I live in South Central LA, and there's like one grocery store in like a 10-mile, 1 or 2 grocery stores in like a 2-mile radius, which is absolutely insane. Right. So task force members said, the lack of grocery stores compared to in Black neighborhoods compared to predominantly white neighborhoods is a clear case of food injustice, but not only that, food apartheid. And so the latest is that SB 1089 was amended actually to remove a provision requiring counties to track grocery store closures. And they narrowed the definition of a pharmacy to exclude pharmacies that are part of health clinics. So I guess since they removed the provision requiring counties to track grocery store closures, it would still, require companies to provide advance notice to employees and county officials if they're closing. But it would just take out the obligation for counties to track these closures, which is interesting, but gets amended throughout these processes, right? But that's why it's important for us to stay engaged. So these, but anyways, that's just a quick overview of, again, the reparations priority package from the CLBC, but then also giving you information about Senator Stephen Bradford's bills, SB 1050, SB 1403, SB 1331, while also kind of giving you an overview of his 2 other bills that were killed, unfortunately. But, with pressure, we can bring those 2 bills back in the next legislative session next year. So
Thank you, Ms. Moore. I hate to cut you short, but I have one more speaker that we have coming on just to wrap up everything that you've said about lobbying our legislators, and that's Ms. Leah Barrows.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. So Camila gave a great overview of the reparations package and all that that means. And I'm going to talk a little bit about lobbying and advocacy. So a little bit about me is that, and I'm just going to do my own introduction since we're short on time. I had to cut my presentation a little bit, but I am the founder and principal of Leah Barrows LLC, which is my political consulting and advocacy firm. I've been working in politics for over 10 years now. I got my start working for Senator Susan Eggman back when she was on the assembly side. I worked as a staffer for 3 years before I started contract lobbying. Over that time, I worked for a few top 10 firms before I opened up my own shop. One of my most notable achievements was working on the Crown Act. So I was the lead lobbyist for that effort. And if you remember, that was the first statewide law in the country to prohibit racial discrimination on the basis of wearing natural hairstyles in the workplace and schools. And just to show you the power of advocacy, similar efforts since we passed in California, similar efforts have been passed in over 20 states, 50 municipalities, and internationally in France. So we're still out there making waves. My current client base includes anything from Fortune 250 companies, industry associations. I always leave space for civil rights, social justice organizations. And I've worked on efforts ranging from anti-discrimination and anti-hate to climate and energy to healthcare to education equity, reproductive rights, you name it. And I say all that to say that you can literally advocate on anything and everything because, as you heard Camila, there are a wide range of bills that go through the California State Legislature. I'm going to start just by giving a little bit of a background on what lobbyists do, because I think a lot of people have an idea, but they don't really know. So just to kind of paint a picture for you, for me as a contract lobbyist, I have various clients. You also have people who work for organizations or who are, in-house. And I represent my clients' interests before the California State Legislature. the governor's office, and state agencies. So lobbying isn't just the legislature, it's the governor, it's all of the agencies and departments as well. So essentially what that means is that I track and monitor legislation, and if there's a bill that's introduced that negatively impacts any of my clients' interests, then my job is to negotiate amendments to make it better, or make sure it doesn't pass the legislature or get signed by the governor. Conversely, if there are bills that we like, we support them, make sure they get enacted into the law. And then in the case of, like, say, the Crown Act, I had a client who had this bill idea. We shopped the language around, found a legislator to author it, and made sure that the bill got signed into law. Again, wide range of people are in advocacy, right? So you have your large corporations, Apple, BMW, AT&T, industry trade associations, social justice organizations, NAACP, ACLU, Zeta Phi Beta. Anybody can be an advocate or have a lobbyist. Even unions have lobbyists. So we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to focus on what I think are two of the most important tools that an advocate can have. One, harnessing the power of storytelling. So what do you want them to know, and how are you messaging your stance, right? Very important. Second thing, building strong relationships. You want to build strong relationships with your legislators and your coalition allies so that you're always in communication early and often. Really quick about the power of storytelling. The reason why I put this in the list of the top two is because legislators and staff really need to hear real world stories when they're listening to people advocate. And this is because it helps them to really visualize the impact of current law or the law that's being proposed. And in order for them to really understand it, you want them to get a feel of the large scale impact of the proposed legislation. Anyone can read bill language. Anyone can read a fact sheet. So when you get time with legislators or staff, you want to use your time wisely so you're not just regurgitating what they already know, right? You want to share a lived experience, paint a picture. It's the most powerful tool that you have, because when you tell an impactful story in such a way that they can not only understand it, so that they can feel it. If they can feel it, then it's easier to sway them. So that's why I really stress the importance of the power of storytelling. Second, and probably is even more important than storytelling, is your relationships, right? You've got to have existing relationships with your legislator. When you establish a relationship with your legislator early, it's key, because when you have those relationships, scheduling meetings and giving input on pending legislation, it's a lot easier to do and less daunting, because they already know you and you already know them. So what I would say is the best way to get started in building that relationship, if you don't already have an existing relationship with your legislator or one of their staffers, is start on the internet, right? It's a powerful tool. You can get so much information just by looking at their websites. You can find out who your legislator is, how do you contact them, where's their office. You get to get a sense of who they are personally, right? Where do they go to school? What were their past careers? What are their hobbies? And this is good to know, because when you're meeting with them, you can shoot the shit a little bit, right? Break the ice, have a meaningful conversation, and that helps the meeting to be more conversational. Figure out what their political passions are, what policy areas are they interested, what types of legislation have they weighed in the past, right? Also, don't forget the district, right? Typically, when you live in an area, you kind of have a feel for where you live, but learn the geographic breakdown, right? What are the relevant statistics? Is it a commuter organization? What's the education level? What's the income breakdown? All of that will help you to craft your arguments, because then at that point, you know them and their district, so you know their pain points and you know how to message whatever it is that you want them to know. So use this information when you're connecting with them. Make sure you have meaningful conversations, break the ice. They're people too. I think one of the biggest things that people forget is that when they're meeting with their electeds and their staff, they get like really nervous and buttoned up, but authenticity goes a long way. Let them know who you are as a person. So you've done your research, right? You know who your legislator is. You know a little bit about them. What next? Camila just gave a whole bunch of information about, all these bills that are going through, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm ready. I want to get in and talk to some people. So you schedule a meeting. The first thing you want to do is decide whether your meeting should be district office or capital office. When you're first starting to build a relationship, I say start with the district office. That's for discussing issues that maybe aren't directly related to legislation. It's, get to know you, meet and greets, Maybe if there's some constituent casework you need, or offering help with engaging in the community. It's often more convenient too, because it's, you know, the district is in your area, so it's easy for you to get there. And when you establish a relationship with district staff, it's important because they have their finger on the pulse of everything that's going on locally. So they're good people to get to know regardless. Now, when it comes to your capital office meetings, those are best for discussing anything related to legislation, right? So a legislator's bill package, their legislative priorities, lobbying, encouraging them to, you know, support or oppose legislation, that sort of thing. And when you're in the meeting with legislators, I would say, make sure you have a good handle on what it is that you're meeting with them about. So I wouldn't take, you know, the full package of reparations bills and say, I want you to support all of these. I would say pick and choose based on what you think has the best political viability, what is most meaningful to you in the community, and what your messaging will be to your specific legislator, just based on how they typically vote and how you think you can sway them. So in the meeting, just be prepared, right? Be prepared to answer any questions to the best of your ability. Like I said, do your research, know what the bills are doing, know where they are, know where they're going. And if you're unsure, it's okay to let them know that you don't know and that you'll find out an answer and get back to them. If you do make that promise to follow up, then actually do it, because people will call you on it. Don't be afraid to directly ask the legislator or staffer if you can count on their support on the issue. You might not always get a straight answer, but you know, things are ever changing, but it's best to at least try, because then it lets them know that you're not just there giving information, you're actually making an ask. Resource. Always let the office know that you'd be happy to serve as a resource, because legislators and staff, they know very high level policy and procedural like pieces of information. It's impossible for them to know everything about everything. So they count on advocates and people like you to fill in the blanks, right? So if you're going in there as an expert in this bill, break it down for them, because they're looking at, you know, thousands of bills each session. And so they need for people to be able to break it down into digestible bits for them. And most importantly, sorry, I've had to cut a lot out, so I know I'm skipping over a lot, but, you know, thank the legislator or staff for the meeting. Make sure you're sending, you know, thank you notes, and, you know, get their business cards so you can do your follow-ups. And yeah, I guess it's just one of those things where the most important thing is just be yourself, be very personable with them, and just remember that they are people too. The relationships that you create today are always going to be powerful alliances in the future. So just make sure that you do the best that you can to keep those relationships hot.
All right, I think we might have time just for one question. If there's anybody in the chat or would like to raise their hand. Well, okay, that might be a good sign. That might mean that you've answered everyone's questions.
This is Pamela Tate. I'm from Fresno, California. I was invited today from Sora Kassan Jones, and I truly enjoyed all the information. I came on a little bit late, only because my link, something was wrong. So she shot it to me again, and I was able to get on. And everything that I heard was very enlightening. I do try to keep up with reparations and what's going on. But what I was going to ask, is there a weekly kind of like a newsletter that we can link on to so that we can stay engaged? Because sometimes when we disperse from one another, we lose that. And so there's something where we all can connect and get a weekly newsletter, you know, a monthly, where we can all just stay informed. And then when you can say vote today, you know what I mean? We can all go and do what needs to be done. And so that's just my question. But thank both of you guys. Great messages.
I would say subscribe to the email updates from the website I maintain, californiareparations.info.
Okay.
Legislative updates. But then also I would say definitely go to CJEC. I put their website, cjecofficial.org.
Okay.
They're an organization that is at Sacramento at the Capitol all the time when these hearings are happening.
Mhm.
You can sign up to their mailing list as well, and they'll give you even more ways to get involved.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Moore.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Leah, as well as Ms. Morrow, I really appreciate the work that you guys put in to be here today. I know I was back and forth with you quite a bit, so thank you for being here. And I am going to turn it over to Sora Jackson.
Thank you. Also, I just want to acknowledge there were a couple of questions in the chat. I believe Ms. Moore answered Mary Clark's and also Monica Harris. Astrid, hi. I'm going to ask Ms. Moore if you can go ahead and reply to her as well. But in the meantime, Mrs. Barrows, do you have your contact information? I'm sure others may have questions about lobbying, how to get engaged, involved. Is there contact information that you can provide so others can contact you if they have more questions?
Yep, I'll go ahead and put it in the chat.
All right, thank you. And then also I just want to acknowledge our regional coordinator of social action, Sora Gillespie, and I'm going to call her up with closing remarks at this time.
Thank you, Sora Jackson. I hope you can hear me. I believe I did take myself off mute. What an awesome job to you and your social action committee, to our two speakers. I am well informed of what is going on in the state of California. I am from Los Angeles, and I do hear about California reparations. I am happy that I now know that it comes in many formats. I'm happy to know how to engage with our representatives to become involved. I am hoping that this does not end the discussion and that California can set it off and become the model to other states, as well as on the federal level. We do need to keep this conversation going. As I think about it, America's biggest sin has been slavery and the discrimination against African Americans, and it hasn't been taken as serious as it has been with other ethnicities. So I thank you two ladies for giving us this information. As I was sitting here, I was thinking that I am only the 5th generation away, as my great-great-grandmother was a slave. Cute little story that has been handed down in the family is she remembered when the Union soldiers came on the plantation and read the Emancipation Proclamation. They didn't understand because they weren't educated, but they understood the word free. So I'm hoping that we can do a little bit more with reparations. And I thank you, ladies. I also thank the Northern California Committee for putting this panel discussion together. I am going to conclude my remarks, and we do have the regional director on. I'm not sure if she's still here or not. If not, Sora Jackson, I'll hand it on over to you.
I believe Regional Director Shante Fuller is still on the line. Madam Regional Director, if you can hear us and if you're able to respond, you can go ahead and provide us with closing remarks. There she is.
Thank you so much, Sora Jackson, and thank you to the Northern California Social Action Committee and also Omega Lambda Zeta chapter for continuing to raise the bar when it comes to highlighting the extraordinary power of she with social, health, and economic justice. This information that was provided tonight is very timely, especially during this critical year of elections. And I just thank you so much for sharing this information. I learned a lot tonight, and I'm interested in receiving additional information and watching the replay just to make sure that I take notes of some of the information that was shared in the chat and for my continuing edification as well. So thank you so much, Source, for this amazing presentation.
Right, and thank you. Stay tuned. It doesn't stop here. There's much work to be done. So thank you all for attending this evening. Thank you for your time. I want to thank the speakers as well for the very plethora of information that we have on tonight. Again, we have recorded the presentation and it will be accessible and available to you so that you can refresh and also share this information. This is what it's all about, is getting engaged. It's about sharing the information so that our community is informed and aware and can properly vote and be informed of what can impact our community. And thank you all so much. And thank you, Silver Green, for taking the lead on this. Appreciate you. All right, if there's no further ado, we'll go ahead and conclude.
Good night.
Good night, you all. Thank you.
Good night.